Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's the day we've been dreading or hoping for so long. It is Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, Election Day in the U.S. of A. And while most Americans are glued to the news here in the United States, we're going to cover some key stories from the U.S. election and related matters, and then take a news-driven trip around the globe. Because in my view, we have spent so much time the last 4 years looking inward. And as Trump has raised the drawbridge of Fortress America, as I like to put it, the corporate media in this country has sharply reduced its reporting outside of our borders. There's a whole lot of shit going on. And most of us don't have a clue. I have to say that includes me. So I hope you find this interesting. And when we hit the foreign desk, I'll let you know. And if that's not of interest to you because you are laser focused on the American election, I'm a guilt-free guy. All you got to do is turn it off. Go flip your remote on and watch the big screen. So my opening question today is, what is the strategy of the Democrats to confront the expected antics of Donald Trump, who has telegraphed that as soon as tonight, he is planning to declare victory, whether the numbers support that or not? A lot of people say, oh, that's ridiculous. But that's how George W. Bush prevailed in both 2000 and 2004. They got Fox News to declare him the winner. And then it became the obligation, the uphill fight of the Democrats to prove that that wasn't true. And once the idea gets locked in by the corporate media and travels worldwide in nanoseconds on Twitter and Facebook, it is very hard to undo that propaganda narrative. And this is a proven style of indoctrinating people, whether the facts support the information or not. So, newsrooms are bracing for a potentially volatile election night tonight. And Trump is expected to make some move, unless the numbers are just a whole blue wave that he can't possibly fight. And he's going to claim that he's the winner, that we've got to stop counting those dreaded mail-in ballots because they're all rigged, they're all fraudulent. Millions of them were mailed out to bums on the street who mailed back 10 each. That's what he would have you believe, or something like that. So corporate media appears to be prepared. They've even gotten advice, a 10-point plan for newsrooms. And the advice comes from an expert, a company called Aspen Digital, which is run by the former president of National Public Radio, who also worked at NBC. Her name is Vivian Schiller. And she advises that if Trump goes on for more than a minute or two with falsehoods, the news outlet should cut away from the live feed and have reporters explain that the elections are not called by their contestants. Explain why such a premature declaration of victory is both wrong and dangerous. And strategically, I am urging Biden and his army of lawyers to look for the moment where they can say that projections and the results that have been published so far indicate that Biden is the winner. And as soon as they can claim that turf, they will have an advantage in the expected post-election skirmishes. And Twitter and Facebook have announced that they will flag posts from candidates who claim to have won the election before the votes have been counted. In Twitter, they're going to post a warning label on a tweet that says official sources called this election differently, or that official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted. I think that's pretty weak, Jack. And over at the Facebook farm, Zuck has decided that the warning labels say that votes are being counted. The winner of the U.S. presidential election has not been projected. And I've seen people who posted various things about the election get their post tagged with a box from the Voting Information Center. I think that's kind of weak, too. I think they simply should not publish erroneous claims of victory by any candidate. And over at Facebook in Menlo Park, Nick Clegg, a former British government official, who's now the VP of Global Affairs and Communications, he was patting his team on the back, saying that they've worked really hard, they're ready for Election Day. But this comes less than 24 hours after an inside company poll was published showing that employee morale is cratering and that many people feel that Facebook has lost its way. And those are the people who work there. So a semi-annual pulse survey taken by more than 49,000 employees in the last 2 weeks of October show that workers feel strained by office shutdowns. They're continuing to lose faith in the company and its mission of improving the world. Only 51% of respondents said they believe that Facebook is having a positive impact on the world. That's down 23 percentage points from the company's last survey in May. In response to a question about the company's leadership, only 56% of employees had a favorable response, compared to 76% in May. Now, for context, it appears that the survey in May was much more positive because it was more framed around how Facebook had managed the elements related to the pandemic. Also, there's been a ban on internal posts of political nature. Employees are allowed to put up whatever they want on their public Facebook page, but on the internal one, they've been trying to avoid political divisions. And it's interesting, despite the negative attitude, 69% still believe the company is a good place to work. So the Washington Post has put together a short list of the flashpoints of legal contention. And as I've pointed out over the last few days, there are more than 300 voting lawsuits that have been filed already. And some of these may have been placeholders, the vehicle for a more aggressive intervention by lawyers and the courts, if it can be shown, for example, that in Clark County, Nevada, or in Philly, which Trump keeps pointing fingers out without explaining why he thinks Philadelphia is such a seat of corruption. So there are at least a dozen major cases in Texas, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Minnesota, and Nevada. And let's just thumbnail them for you. In Texas, it's still in contention whether those 127,000 votes that were cast in drive-through lanes will be accepted. The courts have ruled in that favor, but there could be, after election, legal challenges. And they did shut down the drive-through lanes because they fear there is some issue about whether the technical term of voting in a mobile building or something like that has been met. Pennsylvania, the issue relates to the deadline for mail-in votes to arrive. And we've got Justices Thomas Alito and Gorsuch hinting that they would like to revisit the case after the election. Will ballots be invalidated as a result? North Carolina, can ballots that arrive by mail and the end of the day on November 12th be counted? In Minnesota, can ballots that arrive by mail between Election Day and the end of the day on November 10th be counted? And in Nevada, does Clark County have to provide the signature of every registered voter to the Trump campaign so they can check the work on mail-in ballots? So you see that there's a whole array of potential legal battles that could be joined as soon as tonight or first thing tomorrow. And, of course, all of this could be useless hand-wringing if Biden rolls up a significant margin in Florida and if the early tabulation in Pennsylvania appears to be going in his favor. And also, if the expected higher turnout for Republicans at the polls today doesn't materialize, or if Democrats turn out in similar numbers, that could change the complexion as well. The last time Jason Leopold was on our program, it didn't go so well. I was doing a live Facebook video streaming, and we took phone calls, and Kyle Kyleman called in and was quite dismissive of some of Jason's reporting. And I have found that when Jason is using documents that he has secured under the Freedom of Information Act, his work is stellar. And when he delves into the dark world of anonymous sources and memos and other documents that we're not permitted to see, I'm not so sold on his work. And his latest report, co-authored with Ken Bensinger at BuzzFeed News today, is kind of in the middle, because he got a hold of less redacted portions of documents from the Mueller investigation. And it's interesting what I'm about to share with you. But this report, in my view, is fatally flawed because it still contends that the materials that ended up at WikiLeaks were the result of a Russian hack. And apparently Jason hasn't caught up with the sworn testimony of Sean Henry of CrowdStrike before the House Intelligence Committee, which took place, I think, in 2018 and was revealed at the end of last year. So, with that in mind, and there is no mention of Sean Henry or CrowdStrike in this 20-page article, what is reported is that prosecutors investigated Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and Roger Stone for the hacking of Democratic National Committee servers, as well as for possible campaign finance violations, but ultimately chose not to charge them. Quoting again, although WikiLeaks published emails stolen from the DNC in July and October of 2016, and Stone, a close associate of Trump, appeared to know in advance the materials were coming, investigators didn't have sufficient evidence to prove active participation in the hacks or knowledge that the electronic thefts were continuing. In addition, federal prosecutors could not establish that the hacked emails amounted to campaign contributions benefiting Trump's election chances. And furthermore, they felt that their publication might have been protected by the First Amendment, making a successful prosecution tenuous, they say. Well, when you read this article carefully, and I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast, they cite Mueller's indictment of the 12 Russian GRU officers, which I've always thought was bullshit. An indictment is not evidence. And while it's fair to say that Mueller's indictment was quite detailed about the actions he claimed that the Russian GRU members were responsible for, he gave no evidence. Back to the Leopold article here. Little, however, was known about how intently the special counsel focused on those individuals as possible targets for prosecution during the 2-year investigation. They don't point out that Mueller never talked to Julian Assange, never talked to Bill Binney, who I think has credibly established that it was a leak and not a hack from the DNC. And later in the article, quote, the fact that prosecutors elected not to file any charges in the WikiLeaks matter is an apparent vindication for both Assange and Stone. But Mueller didn't completely absolve either man, noting in a newly unredacted footnote that there were factual uncertainties that were the subject of ongoing investigations. Well, it's been another 2 years, folks. Got anything? Later, another quote from the article, Assange, for his part, was indicted in March of 18 for hacking and violations of the Espionage Act. I think you know that. And a lawyer for Roger Stone said the release of the unredacted sections of the Mueller report vindicate Roger Stone and proves what Stone's been saying from the beginning, that he did not engage in any illegal activity around the emails from the DNC and that he in no way knew the content or timing of their release. Well, he did claim that, but he's a prolific liar, and he got convicted of lying about his lies, essentially. And again, quoting a later passage here from this report, Assange repeatedly denied Russia was the source for the emails, but the Mueller report found that WikiLeaks was also in direct contact with Guccifer 2.0, from who it sought to procure the emails. And nobody really knows who was behind Guccifer 2.0. It could have been an American operation. Quoting again, nonetheless, the newly unredacted sections of the Mueller report show that prosecutors worried they didn't have enough hard evidence to prove that Assange or Stone actively participated in the hacks or were aware that they were ongoing at the time they communicated with Guccifer. Prosecutors did not develop sufficient admissible evidence that WikiLeaks knew of or even was willfully blind to that information. And prosecutors faced what they called factual hurdles in pursuing Stone. They lacked proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Stone knew or believed that the computer intrusions were ongoing at the time he encouraged or coordinated the publication of the Podesta emails. In addition, they worried that Stone, Assange, and WikiLeaks could all be protected under the First Amendment. And this is attributed to Mueller himself. Quote, assuming that no coordination with the campaign occurred, a criminal prosecution of overseas actors providing non-express advocacy information to American listeners would likely be difficult. You want me to unpack that? Overseas actors, that's non-citizens. That would be Julian Assange. Providing non-express advocacy. That means he didn't use it to campaign for or against either candidate. He just put it out there. That's a publisher. And that's what we have argued all along in defense of Julian Assange. I hope you'll check out the article. It helps, I think, clear up some issues that have been murky for over 4 years now. And our friend Gareth Porter, writing today at the Gray Zone Project, takes a look at the latest reported Russian election threat. And he writes that just days before this election, the bureaucratic forces behind the original claim of Russian hacking of state election-related websites in 2016 launched a new drive to spawn fears of Moscow-made political chaos. The new narrative was not consistent with information previously published by the FBI and Homeland Security's new Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It was so incoherent, in fact, that it suggested a state of panic on the part of DHS officials, worried about a possible transition to a Biden administration. On October 20th, Christopher Krebs, head of that agency, CISA, issued a video statement expressing confidence that it would be incredibly difficult for Russia to change the outcome of an election. Then he abruptly changed his tone, adding, "But that doesn't mean various actors won't try to induce chaos in our elections and make sensational claims that overstate their capabilities." Krebs' warning of a possible Russian announcement that hackers had succeeded in disrupting the result of our election was so removed from reality that it suggested internal panic over the failure of Russian hackers to do anything that could be cited as interfering in 2016. 2 days after Krebs' dubious warning, the FBI and CISA issued an alert reporting that a Russian state-sponsored advanced persistent threat actor, this one known as Berserk Bear, had conducted a campaign against a wide variety of U.S. targets. And Porter says that 11 days before Krebs made his speculation, the FBI and CISA issued a separate alert that seriously undercut his questionable claims. Porter analyzes the most striking difference between the two alerts was that the October 9th alert didn't refer to any Russian state-sponsored APT actor, as the October 22nd one did. Contrary to the impression that U.S. officials may have conveyed in referencing APT, it's now widely understood that this term no longer refers to a state-sponsored actor. So, that was just a little fog, generated by our spooks, I guess to prove to us that they're really, really working hard to protect us. I want to recommend a lengthy piece at The Intercept today under the byline of Ryan Grimm. And while, I have my quibbles with some of the arguments that he makes here, particularly about Glenn Greenwald's resignation last week from that news organization, I think that Ryan Grimm advances a pretty interesting set of theories. And this is related to the Hunter Biden laptop, the allegation that there were incriminating emails on it, the surfacing of Tony Bobulinski, who worked for the Bidens and, said that Joe has lied about his knowledge of and some involvement in Hunter's business deals. And Grimm goes on at some length here. But the key takeaway is that he says that there is some meat in this sandwich. It's just that the buns have been bungled by people like Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump. And so Grimm's breakdown is that the story ran on parallel tracks, one legitimate and one ridiculous. The legitimate track was that Bobulinski was ready to authenticate the emails and go on the record. That's what he calls the legitimate track, and a story in the Wall Street Journal would no doubt have landed differently than the one that ultimately was published by the New York Post. But before the Journal published its story, Trump stepped on it. Then Giuliani stepped on it by handing off the documents to the tabloid Post. The Post published first on October 14th, claiming a smoking gun. And Grimm says the gun wasn't quite smoking, but the Post did have an email from a Ukrainian business person thanking Hunter Biden for the opportunity to meet his father. And this would undermine the Biden's claim that Joe Biden's work in government never intersected with his son's business. So this is kind of where my views land. That the Hunter Biden stories that have surfaced are not dismissible as nothing burgers. And that the corporate media blackout, the gatekeepers who have tried to prevent us from learning about this, was unwarranted and counterproductive. So there's more here. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to my next story, but I encourage you to read it. And Ryan Grimm does conclude by saying that he feels that Glenn Greenwald's resignation wasn't warranted. He said, despite the flaws of those pushing the story and the right-wing media's exaggeration of its significance, there was a way the media could have handled it responsibly that wouldn't have been comparable to 2016, but that also didn't fuel outrage over a blackout. So I think there's decent reporting from Ryan Grimm there. Also, I want to mention that BuzzFeed, home of the Listicle, is compiling a list of all of the false disinformation about today's election that will be circulating in social media. The first is a claim based on a screenshot that in New York City some people received ballots that had already been filled out. It's not true. It was just somebody who took a picture of their ballot after they filled it out. Rick Grinnell, the Trump supporter who was briefly the acting director of national intelligence, published a photo of Joe Biden on an airplane that was taken last year and then slammed him for not wearing a mask last year. And in Philadelphia, BuzzFeed has dismissed a claim of political banners hanging within 10 feet of a polling place. All right, maybe it was 15. So now I want to begin my survey around the world of news today. And I'm doing this because right now, all of the focus in the American media is on the election. And I'm speaking to you, it's before 4 o'clock Pacific time. And I don't watch the coverage on the day of the election because it's all speculation. It's all process. We see people in lines waiting to vote. We may hear of a few machine breakdowns and that sort of thing. But I wait until polls close to actually seriously watch. And in fact, I won't be watching the real returns until very late tonight. I'll be co-anchoring some local election coverage on our local cable channel here. And if you want to watch that, the website is cmcm.tv/30. And if that doesn't work, after / put channel 30. And that's where I will be from 9 to 11 p.m. Pacific time tonight. So first we go to Israel and the liberal newspaper called Haaretz. And one of its columnists, Chemi Shalev, says that Israeli Jews owe an apology to American Jews. It's a fascinating parsing of the different points of view of Jews in Israel and Jews in the United States. The overwhelming preference for Trump by Israeli Jews is offset by a poll of American Jews that show that most of them do not support Donald Trump. He writes, many Israelis don't know and don't care to know too much about Trump beyond his pro-Israel or rather pro-Netanyahu decisions and gestures. Empathy for Trump, however, extends far beyond, much deeper than his unabashedly unbalanced favoritism towards Israel. Jewish public opinion in Israel today, with the exception of a dwindling and secular center-left, is mostly right-wing or conservative or both, with a growing appetite for simplistic populism. On top of his direct benefits for Israel, many of Trump's traits, including his abrasiveness, anti-elitism, disdain for Europe, hostility to the media, and rants against the liberal left, render him a more natural fit for Israel than the United States itself. Israelis either turn a blind eye or couldn't care less that Trump has polarized America, sown division and hate, possibly because after a dozen straight years with Netanyahu, it's what they're used to at home. Later, he says, American Jews detest Trump and fear him because of his domestic policies, problematic personality, antagonism toward minorities, while Israeli Jews love and admire him for showering them with gifts and asking for nothing in return. That's true. Nonetheless, Israelis view the overwhelming American Jewish support for Biden as an extension of their misguided support for Obama, especially over the Iran agreement, with the Democratic Party increasingly and misleadingly portrayed in Israel as beholden to a radical anti-Zionist wing. Oh, I wish that were true. Many Israelis view the abiding loyalty of American Jews to Trump's opponents as naive at best and a stab in the back at worst. American Jews, for their part, are disheartened and dismayed by the Israeli near consensus in favor of Trump. In their eyes, whatever benefits Israel has gained from his presidency dwarf in comparison to the untold damage he's inflicted on his own country. How on earth do Israelis favor a president whose vain irrationality enfeebled America's fight against COVID-19, whose authoritarian recklessness endangers the very foundations of U.S. democracy, who demeans and distances himself from most democratically elected world leaders while embracing and promoting its most dangerous dictators? So one more quote here. From the American Jewish point of view, Israel's Trump worship is a moral and ethical failure. It is also a symptom of the growing gap between the two communities, which widened as a result of the confrontations between Netanyahu and Obama. Next, I want to turn to one of my favorite offshore commentators, as you well know, that's Pepe Escobar. And in his latest piece, The Russia-China Vote, he echoes somewhat the comments from some Americans that the oligarchs win, whether it's Biden or Trump. And he takes a look at the Russia-China strategic partnership and contrasts it with what he calls the U.S. dystopia. He says China is on a self-driven path, depending on little to no foreign input. Even a clear pragmatic horizon has been set, 2035. They've also released their new 5-year plan for 21 to 25. And he writes China should be on a par or even surpassing the U.S. in geopolitical, geoeconomic, and techno power by 2035. He says the 5-year plan makes it quite clear that the two key vectors are artificial intelligence and robotics, where Chinese research is already quite advanced. He says big capital from East and West is very much in tune with where all of this is going, a process that implicates the core hubs of what Pepe's been writing about for years now, the new Silk Roads. He said big capital increasingly will move toward East Asia, China, and these new Silk hubs. He says no Western propaganda tsunami can favorably spin what is in effect a devastating 1-2 ideological collapse. Neoliberalism's abject failure in dealing with COVID-19 is manifestly evident all across the West. The U.S. election dystopia is now sealing the abject failure of Western liberal democracy. What kind of choice is offered by Trump-Biden? This is happening just as the ultra-efficient, relentlessly demonized Chinese Communist Party rolls out the roadmap for the next 5 years. Washington can't even plan what happens a day ahead. Then he shifts to what he calls the Russian roadmap. Putin has made a key assertion on the role of capital, stressing the necessity of abandoning the practice of unrestrained and unlimited consumption in favor of judicious and reasonable sufficiency, when you do not live just for today, but also think about tomorrow. And Pepe says, in concert with the endless Chinese experimentation, Putin says that in fact there are no economic rules set in stone. No model is pure or rigid, neither the market economy nor the command economy today, but we simply have to determine the level of the state's involvement in the economy. As a direct consequence of Putin's pragmatic policies, Escobar says, which include wide-ranging social programs and vast national projects, the West ignores that Russia may well be on the way to overtake Germany as the 5th largest economy in the world. And in summing up, Escobar says, the bottom line is, combined, the Russia-China strategic partnership is offering two radically different approaches to the standard Western neoliberal dogma, and that for the whole U.S. establishment is anathema. So whatever the result of the Trump-Biden choice, the clash between the hegemon and the top two sovereigns is only bound to become more incandescent. English is not his first language, but he's really a great writer. And I want to turn to the Orinoco Tribune, which is an English-language Latin American newspaper. And they picked up a column by a guy I infer here is Canadian. His name is Rob Rousseau. The headline reads, Trump or Biden? Whoever wins, the world loses. And he warms up by criticizing each of the candidates. And then he says, Trump has continued a long history of interference in Latin America, helping repeatedly to coordinate the attempted overthrow of Maduro in Venezuela. He went even so far as to appoint Elliot Abrams, the infamous Cold Warrior, who helped cover up the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, as a special advisor on the as-yet unsuccessful project. But if you think he will stop with Trump, he didn't. Biden, who is currently giving every indication that he views Trump's foreign policy, is actually not going far enough. Despite always defaulting to the language of austerity when speaking about social programs or health care, Biden has signaled he has no plans to slash any of the massive military budget set to exceed $7 trillion over the next decade. On the contrary, he made it clear recently that his advisors have suggested in certain areas the budget is going to have to be increased. Biden has given no indication that the burgeoning new Cold War with China will be slowed down in any way. He's criticized Trump for his effort to nonviolently de-escalate with North Korea. What's more, throughout the Trump administration, American liberals have been agitating for increased hostilities with Russia based on their belief in a conspiracy theory about the president being a Kremlin sleeper agent. This Russiagate hysteria was repeated breathlessly on cable news for years following Trump's victory, until the actual investigation failed to turn up anything resembling actual evidence. And then he takes a swipe at Canada. He says the Trump era of foreign policy has been bad, and Canada has been a willing participant throughout much of it, including joining the Lima Group, trying to take down Maduro. The Trudeau government has also indicated by imprisoning Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou at the behest of the U.S. State Department that we, Canada, intend to follow America's lead in increasingly hostile tensions with China. Canada is still enthusiastically supporting the government of Saudi Arabia and Israel as they violate international law on an almost daily basis. So I think that's a very interesting set of commentaries from offshore. Next, we're going to jump around to some developing news stories. Last night in Wien, we call it Vienna, most beautiful city in Austria. The main synagogue was close to a scene where a gunman opened fire on customers in bars and restaurants in the city's main nightlife district as they were getting in a last drop and bite before a new coronavirus lockdown. The shooting left at least 5 dead, including an assailant who is described as a sympathizer of the Islamic State. He just completed a stint in prison and reprogramming because at the age of 20 he had tried to join the Islamic State. So there's certainly much more to find out about this, but mass shootings are very rare in Austria, although it does have much looser gun regulations than other nations in Europe. The guy's name is Fejulai. He is a dual citizen of Austria and North Macedonia. He spread mayhem for 9 minutes until he was killed, and the scene was described as pretty scary. People who were dining, some outdoors, initially thought it was just some minor, struggle between two people. But it turns out that there were shootings at 6 locations. And what we don't know so far is if there were other shooters or if this guy was just moving around quite a bit. So Islamic State militants stormed Kabul University yesterday as it hosted a book fair attended by the Iranian ambassador. They killed 22 and an additional 22 were wounded at the largest school in Afghanistan. Most of the deaths and injuries were students. It was the second attack on an educational institution in as many weeks. Last week, Islamic State also claimed a brutal assault on a tutoring center in the Afghan capital's mostly Shiite neighborhood of Dasht-e-Barchi that killed at least another 24. Now to Africa, where Tanzania is the scene of a post-election skirmish. After a pivotal poll marred by violence, opposition arrests, and accusations of rigging, Tanzania's Electoral Commission said late Friday that President John Magufuli had won a second 5-year term. This led the opposition to call for peaceful protests over the weekend. Foreign and domestic electoral observers said that the vote took place amid censorship of political speech that undermined the credibility of the election and led to widespread fraud and irregularities. We got some of that going on over here. Yet based on the country's constitution, once the Electoral Commission declares a candidate president, no court has the authority to investigate the vote. Tanzania, with a population of about 58 million people, was once a paragon of stability and growing democracy in East Africa. But over the last 5 years, under Magufuli, the country's 5th president, it has made an about-face as he restricted political and civic freedoms, clamped down on the press and human rights organization. The official count from the Electoral Commission is that Magufuli got 12.5 million of the 14 million valid votes that were counted. And for context on this, I have linked to a great report from Raul Diego over at Mint Press News, who helps us understand the situation in Tanzania and the curious notion that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had tweeted his concerns about the politically motivated arrests and violence in Tanzania. Will he offer any concerns about problems with our election here in the United States? No. And it's interesting, coincidentally, the current U.S. ambassador to Tanzania, Donald J. Wright, a medical doctor, was nominated by Trump last year, sworn in April of this year. And he used to work at OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration here in the U.S., and in Tanzania, Wright got the ball rolling a week before the vote on October 28th by questioning the African nation's democracy, asserting in an op-ed that it risked losing credibility in the eyes of the international community over reports of government interference and political violence. Gosh, I wonder if that could happen here. So I think it's an interesting look at what's going on in Tanzania. Then we turn to Ivory Coast, where President Alassane Ouattara, I think that's how it's pronounced, it's spelled Ouattara. Well, he has won a third term in power in Ivory Coast after an election boycotted by the opposition. The 78-year-old Ouattara, who had once pledged to make way for a younger generation, claimed 94% of the vote. Maybe that's the number Trump will use tonight. 2 terms in office is widely seen as the limit there, and the main candidates condemned Ouattara's attempt to win a third term as illegal. But there's a dispute over whether that was in the Constitution or merely a law, and we had a similar issue that was the false basis for the U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia last year. And we'll go to Bolivia here shortly, so pack your bags. Anyway, from Ivory Coast, thousands have fled to Liberia, Ghana, and Togo in recent weeks, fearing the possibility of the same sort of post-election violence that killed 3,000 people 10 years ago. In the run-up to Saturday's vote, protests against Ouattara had grown, particularly in opposition strongholds. The Carter Center, that's Jimmy Carter from Atlanta, expressed concerns that the overall context and process did not allow for a genuinely competitive election. The process excluded a number of Ivorian political forces and was hampered by an active boycott by a segment of the population and a volatile security environment. I do believe that the Carter Center is doing some monitoring of the American election today. Now to Ethiopia, where at least 54 people were killed in a rebel attack in the restive Oromia region over this past weekend. Survivors of the massacre counted 54 bodies in a schoolyard, which was targeted late on Sunday by suspected members of the Oromo Liberation Army, most of the victims described as women and children and some elderly. The violence is occurring in an area of western Ethiopia known as Wolega, and it involved up to 60 armed and unarmed assailants. Curiously, the report indicates that either police or military personnel who were in the area suddenly left. And then this militia group apparently rolled into town. People were dragged from their homes, taken to the school where they were killed. And last Saturday, in Nigeria, an American who lives along the border of Nigeria and Niger, who had been taken for ransom. He had offered $40 to the people who kidnapped him, and they demanded $1 million. So, presumably with presidential approval, Commandos from SEAL Team 6 rescued Philip Walton, age 27, after tracking the phones of his attackers to an area in northern Nigeria. Pentagon statement: U.S. forces conducted a hostage rescue operation during the early hours of October 31st in northern Nigeria to recover an American citizen held hostage by a group of armed men. And it's interesting because one of my conservative Trump supporters, a friend on Facebook, was lamenting that there was no coverage of this op by SEAL Team 6. It's fair to say that TV hasn't covered it because, they're only covering the election and COVID right now. And it's that kind of insular news coverage that Americans get that leave us more and more isolated from the rest of the world. Well, I've been trying to mention every day that once the presidential election is resolved, your humble host will be on the podcast for about 2 weeks, and then I'm going to sign off. I'm heading into retirement, and I've been getting a lot of lovely notes from people saying, no, you can't. We need you. You can't. Well, I must, and I'm not going to accept any appeals. But I'm really floored by this. I opened my email this morning with a note from Karen Keene in Milwaukee. And she sent me $200 via PayPal. And she wrote, "In honor of Election Day, I'm sending you a few dollars to thank you for your grace, style, curiosity, and humor. A few years ago, I turned my family and tribe onto your fabulous podcast. And although they are young, they have become donors, and I recognize these names: Malachi DiLorenzo, Perry DiLorenzo, John Molitor, Jeff Ratner. Yeah, they've been contributing $5, $10, $20 a month. Well, Karen says now they call me a freeloader. So today I'm sending you some pocket change as you ride off into the sunset. Be safe out there and happy trails." Well, Karen, you made my day. That's a really beautiful gesture, and I accept it. If there are any other freeloaders out there who have a pocket bulging with cash and you want to come clean, all you got to do is hit me up at PayPal. Peter at peterbcollins.com is the link. So as promised, there are a couple of different articles published today about Bolivia. And we start at Consortium News with journalist Patrick Lawrence, who says that the election of Luis Arce in Bolivia last month has been much celebrated in circles where people of humane goodwill gather. Arce was economics and finance minister in the socialist government of Evo Morales and was the violently deposed president's chosen successor to lead his party called MAS, or Movimiento al Socialismo. Arce's victory, a thumping 52-31, reversed one of the bolder and nastier of the many right-wing coups in Latin America that the U.S. has led, cultivated, fomented, instigated, what have you, since the early decades of the last century. Lawrence continues, "Have we heard the last from those crucifix-waving Ladino racists who led the coup a year ago this month against Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president?" Let me pause to buttress his comment there about the crucifix-waving parties, because the ambassador of Venezuela, in a speech at the United Nations on Monday, criticized the Catholic hierarchy in Bolivia as manipulators who have dedicated themselves to ignoring the popular vote and supporting a band of fascists who assaulted authority last year, referring to those who staged the coup. Moncada, the ambassador, said today the hierarchy joins the coup groups that will never accept democracy. It is the theology of colonialism. And we have to acknowledge the role of the Roman Catholic Church in the divisions here in the United States, putting an anti-abortion candidate like Amy Coney Barrett to become the sixth vote on the Supreme Court, easily the fifth vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. And the way the bishops of the United States have supported Trump because of abortion and even contraception is forever to their shame, as they have overlooked the greater moral failings, both personal and political, of the Trumpster. So back to Patrick Lawrence's commentary here about Bolivia. He said, this is an important moment to consider. And he is comparing Bolivia and the Organization of American States. Lawrence warns us that there is already talk of yet another coup coming from the right-wing, Catholic-supported oligarchy of Bolivia. He says that Telesur's correspondent in La Paz reported last Thursday that the nation's Unity Pact, an alliance of labor, indigenous, and women's group, declared an unofficial state of emergency in response to apparently widespread calls for another coup, this one even before the inauguration of Arce coming up next week. Lawrence continues, we now have reports that over the weekend the U.S. ended a sanctions exemption allowing third-party shipments of diesel fuel to Venezuela. He also notes that Chileans voted in a referendum late last month to ditch the constitution that was passed under the Pinochet dictatorship so they can write one that reflects who they are in the 21st century. In another post at Consortium News today, Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies start in Bolivia and then move around the world to talk about the regime change operations of the United States and other allies. And let me quote this. It is instructive that the failed U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia has led to a more democratic outcome than U.S. regime change operations that succeeded in removing a government from power. In practice, this means either full-scale war, like Iraq and Afghanistan, a coup d'etat like Haiti, Honduras, Ukraine, covert or proxy wars as in Somalia, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, or punitive economic sanctions like those against Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela. There's more to the piece. I've linked to it and invite you to check it out. Then we turn to the new revelations from one of the mercenaries who was planning to be a part of the Bay of Piglets operation. That is the failed attempt by mercenaries and some hired soldiers in Venezuela to invade that nation this past May 3rd. And it was a total failure. 6 of the invaders were killed. 2 Americans have been arrested, and they've been sentenced to 20 years in prison on conspiracy and terrorism charges. And there is now a lawsuit, a breach of contract lawsuit, brought by a former Green Beret who heads the Florida-based security contractor Silvercore USA. That's Jordan Goudreau. And they organized that failed invasion. They did it under a contract with Juan Guaido. And while they offered him plausible deniability, they're now trying to hold him responsible for the bungled operation that they attempted. So it's a fascinating story. It comes from the World Socialist website. Follow the link in the show file, and you'll learn more. And there is a piece that I consider related over at the Gray Zone Project today under the byline of Sebastian Lamalio. And he takes a look at the rabid exiles in Florida, where we mostly think of Cuban exiles, the anti-Castro gang, who reliably vote Republican. But he says that half of Florida Latinos support Trump over Biden, and that this population includes 235,000 Venezuelan exiles and 400,000 Colombians. And the desperate efforts of Joe Biden to show that he earns those votes by showing his disdain for the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, as well as the Maduro government in Venezuela. And we can't expect much change if Biden is successful in defeating Trump. A minute ago, I referred to the Catholic Church as a negative force. And all we have to do is look at Poland. Now, it is a predominantly Catholic country. What are the numbers here? It's pretty stunning that 33 million of the 38 million citizens are Roman Catholic. And the top court in Poland basically outlawed all forms of abortion, including those to save the life of the mother or those with a, seriously damaged fetus. So today, the right-wing government blinked, and they've announced that because more than 400,000 people took to the streets of Poland, including a massive protest in Warsaw that is described as bigger than anything since the Solidarity protests of Lech Walesa, the government has said that they will delay the implementation of that court ruling. We'll see if that lasts, but it certainly shows the power of people, mostly women, taking to the streets. Likewise, in Bangkok, the challenge to the military coup leaders who currently control the government since 2014, and that was, of course, there was a coup in 2010, there was a coup in 2004, and essentially the military occasionally allows a civilian to run the government and then they take it back. And, of course, the royalty there, and I wish I could pronounce the king's name. It's about 19 syllables long. Maha Vajiralongkorn Bodindrada Bayavarankun. All right, that's my last attempt. He took the throne in 2016, but he operates remotely from Bavaria. He had the constitution changed. He also changed the laws so that he now completely controls the royals' wealth, which is estimated at some $40 billion. And students have been protesting for weeks now. And they have to do it very delicately because there is a very extreme law that can lead to lengthy prison terms for anybody who criticizes or ridicules the monarchy. So, an interesting piece at the New York Times today. A man named Eduardo Siani, who is a cultural anthropologist of Thailand, he explains the culture and the coded messaging coming from the protesters. For example, they all wear black, which is to contrast with the royals who have parasols in the color that represents the astrological sign of the day when they were born. And they mock the symbolism, for example, by looking to the sky, which is considered a source of power. They wear black T-shirts that are also considered a challenge to the monarchy because they evoke a solar eclipse, which is a bad omen for kings. So it's really interesting how this particular uprising is going and the tools that they're using. Also in Indonesia, the protests haven't started, but expect them, because late last night, President Joko Widodo signed a sweeping law. Oh, it has already, sent hundreds of thousands of Indonesians to the streets to protest. It basically completely guts any standards or regulation for workers. It also removes environmental protections and allows certain development projects to proceed without environmental assessments or consultation with indigenous people. The burning of the rainforests may continue without any impediment. And there's stuff in the law that people can't even find because the index is inaccurate. And the bill expanded from, let me see here, an original 812 to almost 1,200 pages. So shit's hitting the fan in Indonesia. And the protests continue. What are we at, 3 months now in Belarus? That started in August after Lukashenko claimed he won his 6th term in an election widely seen as rigged. So I'm sorry to report that I couldn't find any news about the struggle between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the territory called Nagorno-Karabakh. And our corporate media has been failing to cover that conflict in any meaningful way. Now to our COVID-19 update for today, and we're mostly going to focus on what's going on in Europe, but we'll start here in the United States, where the new death count reported yesterday was 540. The new cases back up to 94,000. That is the second highest one-day count since the pandemic began. And Deborah Birx, the woman who has a great collection of scarves, who's been wallpaper behind Trump at many of his briefings on COVID-19. I don't want to be sexist here, but she is showing some real courage, what we would call cojones, for a male. Because she spoke up in a stark private warning on Monday, telling White House officials the pandemic is entering a new and deadly phase that requires a more aggressive approach. And the memo suggested that Trump and his advisors are spending too much time focusing on preventing lockdowns and not enough time on controlling the virus. Quote, "We are entering the most concerning, most deadly phase of this pandemic. This is not about lockdowns. It hasn't been since March or April. It's about an aggressive, balanced approach that is not being implemented." Well, she'll be going to join Anthony Fauci in the trip to HR, because Trump will probably fire her whether he wins or loses tonight. In England, in an effort to, as they say, salvage Christmas, Bojo Boris Johnson has announced plans to shut down pubs, restaurants, most retail shops throughout England. He said the steps will take effect on Thursday of this week and last until at least December 2nd. They amount to a national lockdown. And in a separate report here from the New York Times, we learn that there are a lot of people going hungry in England because the government relief efforts have not reached everybody. There's a man in Leeds, oh, that's a lovely town I've been to, who runs a little bakery called Yorkshire Crust. And he's been giving away free lunches to anybody who needs one. And he said that the demand will continue because the government actions aren't enough. And one of the people who raised attention about this is a soccer star from Manchester United, 23-year-old Marcus Rashford. He shamed the government into donating food for 1.5 million children in England who qualify for free school meals. And he's back in Bojo's face, saying that that needs to be reinstated. So there are serious problems in Britain. And also, when you look around Europe, the spike in cases, the increase in hospitalizations and intensive care units have affected Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain. And in reaction, there are tough new curbs that are not quite a lockdown or a total lockdown. But Italy has been the scene of violent protests for more than a week as the government brought in new measures that go into effect shortly. There have been skirmishes in Florence, Rome, Naples, Torino, Bologna. And polls show that a majority of Italians support the latest restrictions, but many people are resisting. In Spain, they have a nationwide nighttime curfew. They've implemented regional border closures. Anger spilled onto the streets Saturday for the second night running. Looting and vandalism broke out in some cities. 32 arrested, 12 injured in Madrid after a protest over the curfew turned violent. And there were also demonstrations over the weekend in Barcelona, Malaga, Vitoria, Valencia, Santander, and Burgos. And Belgium is the hottest spot for COVID in Europe right now. It's ravaging this small nation with a rate of 1,735 cases per 100,000 inhabitants over the last 14 days. It has the highest rate of infections in Europe. Many hospitals are overwhelmed, doctors being told to show up to work even if they've been diagnosed with the virus. Hospital workers have staged a brief strike to call attention to their need for backup. The government announced strict new lockdown measures. The total number of deaths there is over 11,000, 400,000 total cases, giving it one of the continent's highest mortality rates. And the country is fragmented. There are, I think, 9 different departments or, counties, if you will. And there are 9 different public health leaders. And it has led to inconsistent standards and limits on access to health care. And the real outlier appears to be the Flemish minister-president, Jan Jambon, who initially said that he would not order curfews or shutting gyms, museums, and other public facilities because he wouldn't hose down his house in case it might catch fire next week. So I hope you enjoyed our little tour around the world. Podcast ran a little long today. I've been running a little long most days. But tomorrow we will be back on our navel-gazing focus here on the U.S. of A. and whatever we know about the partial outcome of today's historic election. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it worldwide. You'll find it on YouTube, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.